Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
And good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you're watching us from tonight. Welcome to episode 7 of Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And tonight we've got a great show as I'll be joined by meteorologists in Honolulu, Hawaii and Roanoke, Virginia, as we take a look at what's it like to cover hurricanes in a tropical paradise. Plus, we'll talk about the #1 killer during hurricanes over here in the Atlantic side, and that is inland flooding. If there is anything you would like to know about or subjects you would like us to talk about tonight or in the coming weeks, please send us an email to sendit@cbs17.com. Our digital team is monitoring that email address, and they'll let me know if you've got a question. So would love to hear from you. You can also find all of us on Facebook tonight. Again, I'm Weather Wes Hohenstein on Facebook. We'll be joined in a little bit by KHON meteorologist Justin Cruz. He's Justin Cruz News. He's over in Hawaii. And just up the road from us in Roanoke, Virginia, is WFXR John Carroll. So those are the people in your neighborhood that we will be hearing from tonight. But before we get started, let's talk about what's going on right now. You know, for a long time there, we didn't have much going on in the tropics. Let's talk about what is no longer there, and that is Tropical Depression 3. It was only around for 18 hours. It formed down over here by the Bahamas earlier this week, and literally less than 24 hours later, it got absorbed up into the atmosphere. It wasn't that organized to begin with. We never thought it was going to become a tropical storm. And now the cold front that's really moved through most of the eastern half of the country, that cold front has kind of absorbed the leftovers of Tropical Depression 3. Again, that's what was happening off the East Coast. But down in the Gulf of Mexico, we have something new to watch, a very disorganized area of clouds and thunderstorms that actually is starting to come together from the tail end of that same cold front that's bringing much cooler conditions across most of the country. Now, right now, there is a 10% chance of something developing over the next couple of days. So not that significant, but something we'll keep an eye on, and really the only thing we have to keep an eye on over here in the Atlantic side. Now, two things working against this storm from forming. There's a lot of dry air down around the Gulf of Mexico, which is unusual, but in the upper atmosphere, a lot of dry air. There's also a lot of upper level winds, a lot of wind shear, and that keeps systems from forming. But as you can see, and as we all know this time of year, I mean, the Gulf of Mexico is like bathwater. Those temperatures approaching 90 degrees. That's the one thing working in favor of something forming. But again, we don't expect anything significant to form. Now, this time of year, that is one of the places we watch as we look at the July Atlantic named storm formation points. This is throughout history, all the way back to the 1850s. We take all the storms that have formed in July, and look where most of the dots are. I mean, most of them are in the Gulf of Mexico or off the southeast coast, the two places that I just talked about. So those are the areas that we will watch throughout the rest of this month. As we get into August, though, which is a week and a day away, can you believe, we'll start to look more out in the open waters of the Atlantic where our activity forms. So we've had Andrea before the season started. We had Barry a few weeks ago. If anything were to happen next, we're on the C-named storm, which is back to a female name. It's Chantal. So that is what's cooking on the Atlantic side. Let's take a quick look at what's going on the Pacific side. So two things. Number one, they've got Tropical Depression Delilah formed as a tropical storm earlier this week, and then another large cluster of showers and thunderstorms about 1,000 miles south of the southern peninsula of Baja. Got about a 40% chance of developing. But that is the Pacific side. Let's bring in someone who probably knows a little bit more about the Pacific side, and that brings us to a great excuse to show you this live picture from Waikiki Beach in Honolulu, Hawaii. I would love to just sit here for the next 30 minutes and look at that picture, but alas, we're here to do some other things. That shot, by the way, 4,790 miles from where I am right now, and that is also where we find KHON meteorologist Justin Cruz. He is in Honolulu. It is afternoon there. So, Justin, great to have you tonight. A lot to talk about with you. I want to start with how different it is to cover hurricanes over there. It's totally different than what we do on the East Coast, different conditions, and you guys are in a tropical paradise. Talk to me about what it's like handling the tropics on your side of the world.
Well, aloha from Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm glad you saw the sky cam. We have beautiful weather right now, but we are in the tropics and we have a history of hurricanes hitting the Hawaiian Islands. And when we track hurricanes, we're actually tracking two areas of the Pacific. We're tracking the Central Pacific and the East Pacific. The Central Pacific, which is our jurisdiction here in Honolulu, they're forecasting 5 to 8 cyclones that would either form in the Central Pacific or move in from the East Pacific. Now, the East Pacific, it's where it's very, very active. There's very low wind shear in the East Pacific as a whole, and there's much warmer water in the East Pacific. And the National Hurricane Center for this year has forecasted 15 to 22 cyclones just forming in the East Pacific itself. Now, the Central Pacific and Hawaii, we're actually very small targets in the big picture. But again, Hawaii does have a history of direct hits with hurricanes. It's not often, but it has happened. And the last time that happened was 1992 with Hurricane Iniki, which was a Category 4 when it went directly over the island of Kauai and caused catastrophic damage. Now, we haven't had a direct hit from a hurricane since then, but we've had some near misses, we've had some close calls, and we did have last year Tropical Storm Olivia, which made landfall over Maui as well as the island of Lanai. It was a double landfall. Most of our systems actually don't form in the Central Pacific. A vast majority form in the East Pacific and make this amazing 2,000-mile trek across the East Pacific into the Central Pacific, and most of them do fizzle out before they make it to the Hawaiian Islands. But I'll give you a good example. This is last year's activity for tropical cyclones and hurricanes. Let me pull it up here. My computer will let me. And just to give you an idea how active the East Pacific is, there was only one system that formed in the Central Pacific. That one got a Hawaiian name. That was Walaka, and it's this one right here. It kind of moved west and then swung up north. All of the other systems, there were 25 total systems that formed in the East Pacific that eventually made it into the Central Pacific. It's amazing. This is the breeding grounds for the Pacific hurricanes and tropical cyclones. So we're actually watching two areas. Right now, it is active with the Central Pacific, and it's just amazing that it can either make it close to or directly hit the Hawaiian Islands. Now, last year was a very active season for the Hawaiian Islands, and we had a close call with a Category 4 and a Category 5 system by the name of Lane. This shut down schools. We were really very, very worried about it. But again, this formed in the East Pacific. It was a Category 4, and it made this trek, briefly a Category 5 actually, made this trek due north towards the Hawaiian Islands, and then it just hooked to the west. So it was a very close call. A lot of people were on edge with Hurricane Lane, and thankfully, it did not make a direct hit to the islands, although it did cause some major, major flooding, and that was really the main effect of that system. And then I mentioned Olivia, again, which formed in the Central Pacific, made its way across and made direct landfall over the island of Maui and Lanai. That was the first system ever to make a double landfall in the Hawaiian Islands. Again, this was not really a wind event. This was more of a rain event for the Hawaiian Islands. So that's what we're watching. And, you know, right now, you mentioned that system earlier, Delilah. That is a tropical depression. The next one that we're watching is that area of thunderstorms. And with, with any kind of hurricane forecasting, you're watching clusters of thunderstorms. If they persist for more than 24 hours, they start spinning, then there's a good chance that they could be a significant system. Our most active months here in the Pacific are similar to the Atlantic. It's August and September, but we've had hurricanes and tropical systems even in January. So it's something we constantly keep an eye on throughout the course of the year, regardless of hurricane season.
Wow. You know, that's fascinating, Justin, because, we don't get to pay attention a lot to what's happening on your side of the world. You were born and raised in Guam, and you've been there in Hawaii for more than 20 years working. How does this impact a place like Hawaii that is all about tourism? I should say it's a lot about tourism. How do the tourists handle it? How do the people that live there handle it? Is it no big deal for a tropical paradise?
Yeah, it's a very big deal. One of the biggest concerns is our geographical location. I mean, we're very far away from the U.S. mainland. So if a system were to hit and cause damage, let's say to the airport or the ports, we wouldn't have supplies for weeks on end, because those would be knocked out. And who knows how long it would take for us to recover from that. So everybody here in Hawaii should have supplies for at least 2 weeks. And we're talking the water, the medicine, the food, 2-week supply. They used to tell us to have 1 week supply, but due to the hurricanes from last year, we learned a lesson that even if we don't get a direct hit, we could still have some major impact. So it's a 2-week supply. As far as tourism here in Hawaii, I think the hotels have contingency plans on what to do. They're stocked up. They have definite plans on how to treat natural disasters, where to go for their guests, and also supplies for their guests should a hurricane hit.
Now, tropical information is what we're talking about today, but I'm curious, what are your other big weather threats? I know you guys talk a lot about the trade winds over there. I know some of your mountaintops might get snow, but you guys also have volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis to worry about. What are some of your other big concerns there in the weather department?
Yeah, we get a little bit of everything here in the tropics. We do have, during our winter season, which is what we call our wet season, we do have some cold fronts moving in from the northwest. Maybe they're on the weaker end of the cold fronts here in the tropics, but they can cause significant flooding too. We also have to cover tsunamis, and we potentially can get tsunamis from our own Hawaiian island, also from Chile, from Russia, Alaska, Japan, and, there's no tsunami season. The entire year is tsunami season. So that's something we're always tracking, how large these earthquakes are, and if these earthquakes are large enough underwater to cause tsunami warnings. And then we had that volcano last year. Kilauea erupted, and I covered that as well. That's something, you never know where these fissures are going to open up in the ground. And thankfully, the eruption stopped. But for a few months, everyone was on edge. We had such an active hurricane season last year. Then we had flooding from cold fronts and upper level lows also last year. And then to top it off, a hurricane eruption that lasted, through 4 months or so. So it was a little bit touch and go last year as far as natural disasters for the state of Hawaii.
Wow. I don't think that's surprising, I think, to a lot of us. I'll get you out of here on this, Justin. How often do you get to go down to where we saw that camera on Waikiki Beach? Do you hopefully get to enjoy the beautiful beaches there as much as possible?
Absolutely. I'll tell you, our studios here at KHON2 is about a mile from Waikiki. So we're very close. And we do a lot of live shots from Waikiki. That's where they do 4th of July fireworks, New Year's fireworks. I love the beach, but we have beautiful mountains here. So if you're not a beach person, some world-class hiking can be done here on our mountains. Beautiful views of the other side of the island, the windward side, Kailua, for example. So there's a lot to do. You got to take a break and come on down.
Right. Well, thanks for rubbing it in that you work a mile from one of the most beautiful beaches in the world. That is Justin Cruz. He is almost 5,000 miles away from me here in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you'd like to follow him on Facebook, he's Justin Cruz News. Justin Cruz News. Justin, thank you so much, and good afternoon to you.
Thank you.
Now we'll continue to kind of take a look at what's happening with the Pacific. He's got a whole different set of hurricane names than we do over here on the Atlantic side. So we showed you Delilah, and he talked about some of the names they had last year. Those weren't our names. Pacific has a whole different set of names. They've already had a Cat 4, Barbara, on this is the Eastern Pacific side. He mentioned they've got kind of 2 sectors, an Eastern Pacific and a Central Pacific. So that's their list of names. We got some new information over here on our side of the world today. Not today, earlier this week, involving El Nino forecast. And El Nino forecasts are very important in determining how active the hurricane season is. If you have a really strong El Nino, that typically means you have stronger upper level winds. Stronger El Nino usually means less hurricane activity. The opposite of El Nino, La Nina. When you have a stronger La Nina, a lot of times that can mean more hurricane activity. So the new information we got this week, and I know this is a really complicated line graph. I'm going to show you a great example of how the forecast for El Nino has changed. So this was the forecast in June. And we have this graph that's showing everything above this 0 line right here where my hand is. So the more you go this direction, the stronger the forecast for El Nino is being predicted. The other direction would be for La Nina. So this was in June. Watch what happens with the July update for El Nino that takes us through August, September, and October. Watch what happens to all these lines. Did you see how far they dipped down? I'm going to go back one. Okay, so from June to July, watch how far they go down. That may not mean much just by looking at the lines, but the information that's telling us is it is looking less and less likely we're going to have strong El Nino conditions in the busiest part of the hurricane season. So if we don't have strong El Nino conditions in the busiest part of the hurricane season, August, September, and October, that means we could have more activity if you just look based on El Nino and how it impacts with upper level winds. So that's something to think about as we go throughout the season. As you know, the tropical season really gets going in August and September. It peaks on the 10th of September. This simple graph kind of shows activity as we go throughout the year. But remember, we're still way back here. So we have a long way to go before the peak of the season. So that's what's going on. Some new information we got this week with El Nino. We also got some new information on inland flooding. And that is a big deal when hurricanes approach, not necessarily the beach, but those who live a few hours inland. And to talk more about that, let's move on to our next guest tonight. And for that, we're going to head up the road to Virginia. Here's a live look at Sandbridge Beach in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And about 4 hours inland from that, we welcome in WFXR Chief Meteorologist John Carroll in Roanoke, Virginia. John, good to see you. As I mentioned, big news in the week about some inland flooding, stories that we deal here with in central North Carolina and you deal with up in Roanoke, Virginia. It's the #1 killer when a hurricane approaches. Talk to us about that new story and how it impacts you guys.
Yeah, it is rather amazing that, again, we are still well inland, but we get impacted, not very frequently, but we do get impacted by some significant rainfall, which you've been telling us about the inland flooding scenarios that go on. A very recent unfortunate events that we had over just the last season, we had 2 hurricanes that moved on through and generated some fatalities well inland, and mainly due to water-related fatalities. Basically what we're talking about is flooding. Now, Florence moved through last year and created 3 fatalities, and Michael came up through our area and generated 5 fatalities as well. There was 1 fatality due to a tornado, and that was in and around the Richmond area, but right specifically in through portions of the Roanoke region is where we did see those fatalities. So again, there is a bit of a concern, and there are some factors that are involved in our area that generate that localized flooding even without the tropical systems that come on through. And we have different what we call little microclimates in areas that generate weather kind of on their own and do a little different scenarios with each one of them. So we have mountains in the New River Valley, and again, the mountains kind of create flash flooding. You get those 2,000, 3,000 foot mountains that can channel and funnel some of that water down into the lower levels. So we do have that going on with us in and around through the NRV, back up in through portions of the highlands. But we also have in through the region the Blue Ridge Mountains and also the Blue Ridge itself, that escarpment, that cliff that is fairly well defined right along here. We get that Blue Ridge Parkway that a lot of us like to drive on. It's a beautiful road that we can drive on, but also meteorologically that also helps us to funnel some of that water down into the lower levels of our region. So the rain collects at the base of the Blue Ridge, moves off the Blue Ridge Plateau, funnels down into some of our lower levels. And then our final topography area that I will talk about is the Piedmont location. And what we have with that is a number of large stem rivers, big rivers. The Dan River, the James River, the Roanoke River, or the Stanton River. It changes name halfway through. But again, this is where a lot of that water kind of collects. And with that inland flooding, from recent tropical systems that came through, we did unfortunately have some major problems in the form of flooding and some deaths. So let's just take a look back at Florence. It came through from last year. And again, this is just our local areas. I'm going to get into the national picture in just a second. But as Florence just moved through, I guess the line brings it through southwest Virginia, we did see about 7 to 10 inches of rain that fell in those areas I was talking about, in through portions of the higher elevated locations, down in through sections of our lower elevated locations. And this is what generated all that flooding. And we did have 3 fatalities from that. Michael, a much faster storm, obviously, came through as a tropical storm. And an interesting thing with Michael, we got rain the day before at about 4 to 8 inches on the day before Michael comes through, and the actual rain from Michael came through and gave us another 4 to 8 inches, but that fell in about 10 to 12 hours, and that overtook everything. Saturated soils and such were already compromised, and then when Michael proper came through, we had those problems as well. So what are we talking about as far as the fatalities? Well, directly related fatalities to Florence. Now, you can see that the numbers here, 1 death due to a tornado, 4 deaths due to wind, in other words, trees knocked over onto people and causing problems and death there, but 17 deaths were water-related, meaning flooding deaths. And out of the 22, we had 17. But for Michael, a little bit different story. 16 directly related fatalities. This is through the whole landfall process. 6 deaths were due to wind. 6 deaths were due to storm surge, so that's more coastal, and 5 deaths were water-related or inland water-related deaths. So recently, at the National Hurricane Center conferences, there's been a lot of chatter about what's going on over the past several years about the inland water fatalities and water-related fatalities. Percentage-wise, they really do outnumber the other related fatalities, in other words, the wind, and some of these are included with the storm surge. But if you see the percentages, 2016, 83% of the fatalities were due to water-related injuries or deaths. In other words, we're talking about drownings. 9% on 2017, 91% were due to water-related fatalities. 31 in 2018, and 69 were related to water, in other words, drowning. So as we lop those together for the 3 years, and again, 4% of those are due to storm surge, but water continues to be a major issue as far as inland flooding is concerned. And I think a lot of this has to do, Wes, and we could talk about this a little bit, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that when these storms do come, we are very well prepared. We see them coming for days on end. So we do get away from the coastal regions, and where people go is inland. And again, the slow-moving storms, Harvey, Florence, they really do generate a lot of rainfall in very specific areas as they are slow to move over top. As you know, that the hurricanes, they're measured by wind, but they don't have to necessarily be measured too much by the actual rainfall. That's measured in the slow process that these storms move across. So I think a lot of these have to do with the fact that we're clearing these beaches out due to our warning systems, and people have to go inland, and then they might get in trouble because of the rains falling in. Very slow-moving storms like Harvey and Florence are generating significant amounts of rain. 60 inches from Harvey, about 30, 35 from Florence, I believe, in coastal areas of North Carolina. So I think there's a lot of that going on. I mean, the statistics are impressive, but I think there's a lot of factors that do get involved with this as well.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that you guys, even farther inland than us, got that much rain with last year's storms. You know, you've been more than 20 years covering big storms like this. What's one of the worst that you've seen in your time?
Actually, I want to say how old I really am, but my first year on the air was Andrew. And I was up in Montana, so I really wasn't covering that all that much. But I did spend some time in portions of Alabama. I worked in Birmingham, Alabama, and I never really got to do the get down to the coastline and stand in the wind and rain, which I'm kind of proud about. But I did do hurricane. It wasn't actually, it was Tropical Storm Josephine. And that was down in '96, and it came in Apalachicola Bay. So that, for me, was the personal experience of actually getting into a tropical system at the coast. But it really wasn't that big of a wind maker, but it was still, it still sticks in my head very much as to what was going on. So again, personally up in through this region, I've been here 4 years, and again, Florence and Michael, they were just, hopefully we never see anything like that again, that's for certain.
Right. At one point, Florence was moving, what, 2 miles per hour? Something crazy like that?
Right, yeah. Yeah, an insane slow process. And then this was moving through, and you guys down in the coastal areas of North Carolina got, what was it, 35, 40 inches of rain there. And the other factor, you know, you had Harvey, which did kind of like a loop-de-loop right over top of Houston, just stayed there for a day or two, and there were like 60 inches of rain with that. So again, Michael, fast moving, 10, 12 inches of rain at the coast. We got, you know, 4 to 8. But over 2 days, it was 8 to 16. But yeah, the speed of these storms, I think, is instrumental in the flooding processes well inland. I think that's what we're looking at in a lot of these statistics.
Yeah, and you know, we've had a couple of storms the last few years that have loop-to-loop. You know, we just talked to Justin all the way over in Hawaii, and he showed us that track of the storm that it literally stopped and did a hard 90-degree left turn to avoid a major hit in the islands. I've never seen anything like that. I hadn't seen that track before, but I mean, we've had crazy loop-to-loops and slow-moving storms on the East Coast that, you know, have us banging our heads in the wall, but while they're loop-to-looping, they're still dropping tons of rain.
Yeah, and that's the problem. And again, I think a lot of times, again, with statistics and percentages and such, you can, you know, have a tough time seeing, well, how many people was this involving, or how many fatalities were there? But percentages are, you know, it's an interesting statistic. But I do believe that the slow movement of storms is the biggest problem inland as far as we're concerned. The good news, by the time those types of storms, the tropical storms, get to our area, they're pretty much getting on the horse and getting out of here.
Right.
Usually they slow down as they get to the coast, and then, you know, like Florence was just, or is it coming in, and it, you know, it was a 4, a 2, it was a 1 right off the coast, and came in and it stopped. You know, and then it went down into South Carolina, and then came up into our area. But by the time it got to us, it was moving pretty good. And we had, I think, 11 tornadoes with Florence as well, and that was one of the fatalities that we mentioned as well.
That's more than we had,
and that was from an outer band.
Yeah, and that's more than we had in central North Carolina. You mentioned 1992, Andrew, one of the first storms you were around for. I remember 1992 only had 7 named storms. So you say that to someone, that you only have 7 storms in a season. That sounds like a pretty good year, but it was probably one of the most devastating years because Andrew was so bad for South Florida. Just proof that it doesn't matter how many storms you get. You know, we say that a lot, but 92 is proof, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, too, is as far as it just takes the one. You know, it just takes, you know, the 2 for us. We had Florence and Michael. And the other thing I didn't mention either was that we had Florence come through, and in less than a month, Michael came through. So we were still kind of cleaning up from Florence as Michael was making a beeline for Panama City and Mexico Beach. And I'll tell you, it was, again, a devastating move as it came through. And that did come through quickly. But again, we had that pre-rain, and then we had the actual rain, so that really devastated us. And yeah, you're right. It only takes 1. Last year we took 2. You know, and the year I was at 17, wasn't there a number of Cat 5s that you know were registered, but a few made landfall, and none made landfall as Cat 5s. But yeah, there was the activity is intensifying, and you know, sea surface temperatures and warming air and evaporation rates are all playing a part in our developing scenarios with this, and I'm convinced that there's you know, things we need to do to prepare ourselves for you know, tougher times ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got the proof that the planet is warming, and now, you know, as I talked about at the top of the show, you know, maybe not as strong a El Nino. We'll see how that plays into the end of the season. That is John Carroll. We will leave it there, John. If you're ever up in the Roanoke area in Virginia, check him out on WXFR. He is the chief meteorologist. John, good to see you. We will talk to you down the road. And guys, that is it for us tonight. It is almost 8:30 on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Eye on the Storm. Don't forget, we will be here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. That means we have 18 weeks left to go. Thank you for spending part of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Wes Hohenstein.